reading a book by Rob Ford and Matthew Goodwin on the rise of UKIP called The Revolt on the Right. And they have this socio-economic group called Left Behind, they call it Left Behind, who have been basically let down by a government, by a series of governments that haven't cared about their communities. They've been very focused on cities. And the people who are left behind find it much harder to get work, have less formal education themselves, and so are much more angry and much more tempted by extremist parties. So I think that kind of shows the difference in this demographic problem you're talking about. So you've got this kind of triple whammy effect. You've got a sort of socio-economic issue, you've got a teacher supply issue, and you've got also an issue with, because you don't have many outstanding schools in those parts of the country, it means the sorts of policies the current government are very focused on, self-improving system type policies like academy chains, teaching school alliances, are much less likely to work because you don't have the core of outstanding good schools to build that kind of, those kind of hubs and chains and federations out of. So the sort of focus of government policy has also been very much on cities too. So there's a kind of triple whammy effect that makes it really hard. And the government and the Labour Party and Ofsted have all noticed this is a massive issue. The new gap in English education is between the cities and these parts of the country. But they don't really know what to do about it. So this is my number one hardest policy problem. Now there's some things you might be able to do around those levers I talked about at the beginning. You could give these areas more money. Historically, cities have got a lot higher per pupil rates than these other parts of the country. So that's one thing you could do, but it doesn't really solve your problem, just giving people money. It might help a bit. Structural reform. I mean, London Challenge worked in London. Is it going to work in Norfolk, where you don't have that group of outstanding schools to build it around? It might be worth a try, but it's not obvious that's going to work. What you really need is the teachers. You really need teachers and leaders to want to go to these parts of the country. And there's no lever you've got in that list that's going to help you do that. Because the reasons that people aren't in those areas aren't ones that government can do an awful lot about, or not easily anyway. So I didn't promise any solutions to any of these problems. Otherwise it wouldn't be hard if I had the answer. But I think there might be something here around something the governments are very, very bad at, which is moral purpose. There might be something around getting teachers, especially those who maybe don't have families yet, to go collectively to parts of the countries that are struggling the most, and engage in challenges to try and change communities. And actually, if you look at that map and where UKIP are strongest, and think how do we stop this sort of shift towards extremism in the country? How do we deal with the anger that people justly have because they've been ignored by government policy for so long? Well, actually, education is a really good way to start. If we can get into the schools in those parts of the country and really transform them and transform the education system in those places, you can start to rebuild those communities. So I think it's an incredibly important one to start with. Okay, I'm going to move on to my second problem. How do we help all teachers improve? Now, those of you who went to see either David Weston or Rob Coe this morning will have heard a lot about professional development already. And at the school level, there's not massive amounts of information, but there's some fairly good guidance about how schools should do professional development so that it's as good as it can be. But I'm thinking about the government level. What can government do about continued professional development? And again, it's something that all the parties are thinking about. They all know it's important. They don't quite know how to get at it. What's the problem? Well, we know that only 0.5% of schools' budget is spent on professional development, which is much lower than countries that do better than us educationally. It's a lot of the money they are spending is on very poor quality provision. It's on day-long courses that haven't been assessed, haven't been evaluated properly. I mean, I think David Weston and Rob Coe again both had slides showing the type of professional development that works best is intensive and sustained and school-based, and that's not Of course, there are some schools who do it brilliantly, but it's still far too rare in the system to see that. And yet we know it's profoundly important in school standards. We just did a piece of research at Teach First. We looked at Curie, the research agency, looked at some of the partner schools that Teach First works with that are absolutely outstanding, given that they're all working with a very low-income demographic. And also looked at some who are just doing averagely, which for that demographic is still good, but not outstanding. And the big, clear difference was that the outstanding schools had systematic professional development built through school and were doing it really, really well. That was the big difference. That's what turns a good school into an outstanding school. So we know what the problem is. What can government do about it? Well, I think there's some negative things that prevent good CPD happening that government could do. I think some of those levers have been pulled a bit hard, which is one of the reasons why CPD is actually quite difficult to get right in a lot of schools, and why people aren't particularly focused on it, and that predominantly comes down to Ofsted. I think that this will probably be familiar to many of you. This is from the teacher workload census that came out, and showing that teachers are now working, or say they're working, the group that were looked at, 60 hours a week roughly, which is a lot, and it's gone up a lot in the last 4 years. And what's been driving that? Because actually we don't have, we're slightly above the OECD average in the amount of time teachers spend in the classroom, but we're not massively over the average, and that hasn't changed in the last 4 or 5 years. So what's been driving that increase in workload? A lot of it's been down to compliance, and compliance with what people think that Ofsted want in their lessons. Now, I have been campaigning for a little while now to have Ofsted not separately inspect teaching in schools, because I think that it's impossible to tell anything from 20-minute observations, or it's impossible to tell very much from 20-minute observations, and that the process of them being in the classrooms and doing those observations has pushed professional development towards being about Ofsted preparation and away from being about what it should be, which is the sort of stuff that David and Rob were talking about this morning. And in response to people who say, well, yes, but if Ofsted aren't looking at teaching, what are they doing? Well, actually 97% of teaching grades are the same as the attainment grade anyway. So they're using the attainment grade to decide what the teaching grade should be. So separately going into classrooms and drive it seems like a huge cost to be having such a massive effect on professional development, and yet actually in practice they're using the attainment grade anyway. So I think there's, and actually, just another point, this is also from the workforce census. I thought this was really interesting. This was in response to what would improve the quality of teaching and pupil learning. People had 3 choices. Professional learning and development, 8% of teachers chose that as one of their 3 choices for what was improved the quality of teaching and pupil learning. Some of these other ones were also kind of about professional development, like observing good practice in other schools. But it struck me that that was incredibly low to be at 8%, which made me think that people associate professional learning and development with Ofsted preparation and with things that they don't think are actually going to help them. And that should be a lot higher to me, because that's the obvious thing that would improve teaching and pupil learning in a normal organisation. That's learning and development is how you'd improve what you're doing. So I think there's something negative the government can do. They can remove a barrier, but that isn't going to make CPD great. Just not having the barrier isn't going to make it great. What can you do to make it great? I actually don't think there is any short-term policy available to the government. Going back to those levers I talked about at the beginning, I don't think pulling any of them is going to help. There's been whenever you have this discussion, someone always pipes up with, let's have a CPD entitlement. Let's have some hours or an amount of money that every teacher gets. To me, that's actually going to be actively unhelpful in solving this problem, because firstly, because it would become a maximum entitlement. Schools would see that as what you got and what professional learning, professional development is about, and also because it would move it to being about the individual again, and actually the best professional development happens systematically, not top down, but it does happen systematically through the school. And also giving people an entitlement, giving people some money, doesn't mean there's anything actually good for them to spend it or do with it. It doesn't solve your problem of supply, which is the big problem. We don't have enough good quality professional development in the system. people often talk about Singapore when it comes to professional development, and they do have an entitlement, but they have an entitlement in a context where all the professional development is basically delivered by one organisation, because it's such a small country. And so it's very different to a situation where you just said everyone have some money and go off and find your own thing. That actually is just going to fragment, not help. So I don't think there is anything government can do here, and I have told a lot of politicians I don't think there is anything short-term, punchy, manifesto ready that you can stick in that's going to solve this problem, even though it is a very big problem. But I do think that there are some long-term things that we could be thinking about. So I think basically, if I was in government, I would be thinking about seeding a lot of stuff, by which I mean I'd want this can only happen from the ground up. This problem will only be solved if schools and teachers and senior leaders maybe are free of some of the pressures they have in existing at the moment, but also if they become more used to using evidence-based evaluation to judge what they should be doing in their schools. That's only going to happen through a very slow cultural change in the system. There's nothing you can do to make that happen quickly. It took decades in medicine, it's going to take decades in teaching. But you can seed things. So I do think the Royal College of Teaching is a good idea, but I don't expect it to do miracles overnight. It's going to take a long time before that kind of thing could be effective. I do think the government should give that some seed funding. I think initiatives like this, like Research Ed, government should be looking at supporting as well as seeding anything else in that kind of space that can just help shift the culture of the profession towards one that is better, that is using evidence and evaluation to judge professional development. Okay, so my third problem, check the time, my third problem is a contentious one, I think, and this is how do we mitigate the negative effects of high stakes accountability? Because this isn't about something that governments need to find a lever that isn't available. This is about one of the levers. This is about the only lever that actually works for government, but it also creates very strong negative effects. Now you might look at that and think that's actually really easy to solve, just get rid of high stakes testing. But I think that would be a mistake, and I think actually why this problem is so hard is because high stakes accountability has a lot of benefits, but the negatives are part of the same coin. So how do you keep the benefits without having the negative effects? Now, in terms of what those benefits are, I recently met with